Hello, and welcome to The Excerpt. I'm Romina Ruiz-Guadiana, co-managing editor for politics at USA Today. Sagui Dekel-Chen was 200 yards from his home on October 7th when a group of Hamas terrorists stormed Kibbutz Nir Oz. All told, the siege went on for hours, claiming the lives of 1,200 people and 200 were taken hostage. Sagui was last heard from that Saturday morning at around 9:30 a.m., before vanishing into Gaza. 10 months later, and with ceasefire talks at an impasse, Jonathan Dekel-Chen, Sagui's father, and other families of hostages are at the Democratic National Convention to say to Americans, don't forget our loved ones. Jonathan, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about your son?
Well, my son is a 36-year-old now, father of 3 little girls. His birthday, it's about 2 weeks ago. On October 7th, as you said, he was about 200 yards from his home on the kibbutz, pursuing one of his great loves, which is refurbishing old buses into usable objects. This time he was refurbishing 4 old airport buses into mobile technological classrooms for underserved communities in the south of Israel. And that kind of tells you who this young man was, a person of service to our family, of course, to our kibbutz community, but to the entire region, primarily for underserved communities, whether Bedouin or Jewish or any other. He is what I guess you would call a guy who loves being the father of little girls. His youngest, her name is Shachar, which means dawn in Hebrew, was born 2 months after he was taken hostage. He has yet to meet her, but by miracle, his wife, who at the time was 7 months pregnant, and his 2 daughters survived the massacre on Nir Oz.
Now, as you well know, 6 bodies were recovered earlier this week. When was the last time you had any news about your son?
I point out that 4 of those 6 recovered bodies were from our kibbutz, Kibbutz Nir Oz, all of them friends of mine, one of them a kind of blood brother. For them, we had confirmation as of a couple of months ago. 3 of them appeared in a Hamas terror video. So we know that they were alive for months in captivity and were murdered while being captive. As far as Sagui is concerned, the last positive sign of life that we received came in late November, early December. There was an original hostage deal in which about 100 Israeli hostages came home. Of those 100, about 40 were from my kibbutz, women and children. And some of them were able to tell us after they came home to Israel that they had seen and spoken to Sagui in the tunnels under Gaza a couple of days before their release. He was alive, wounded, which we already knew, and alive. And they also spoke with a number of other people from our kibbutz, including the 4 men who were returned, their bodies were returned to us yesterday.
Now, you mentioned this video where there was confirmation approximately a month ago that these men were alive. There have been ceasefire negotiations that are ongoing and seem to stall. Do you think that it is time for Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu to end the war? Do you think that it's the only way that Sagui will come home?
Well, the time, I think, is long past to end this war. Those people, even here in Chicago and elsewhere, who are protesting against Israel for Palestine, demanding a ceasefire, we want it as well. It's the only way to get our loved ones home and to stop the madness in Gaza, to stop the suffering of well over 1 million people. So we're in complete agreement around that. As far as our government is concerned, well, that's a big part of the reason that I and many other hostage families and our supporters around the world have been applying pressure to the degree that we can as private citizens on the government of Israel, but also on Hamas, which sparked this whole horrific odyssey that we find ourselves in by, on October 7th, massacring nearly 1,500 Israelis, mass rape, initially taking 240, mostly civilians, hostage, and laying waste to communities, including mine.
Now, you mentioned your government, but you are also American, and so is Sagui. You're from Connecticut, I believe.
Initially, yeah.
I wanted to ask, because we're here at the Democratic National Convention, if you have ever had the opportunity to meet with Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yes. There are this may surprise people, but of the 109 hostages still being held by Hamas, 8 of them are U.S. citizens, dual citizens, Israeli and American, represented by 7 families. And these 7 families have been privileged really to meet all of the senior officials in the Biden administration, including Vice President Harris. Other families have met her twice. I've only had the opportunity to meet her once, some months ago in her office in the White House.
And what did you tell her when you had the opportunity to speak with her?
We told her our stories, and she was extraordinarily empathetic to our suffering, to our predicament. We didn't even have to ask her to continue the policy. At that time, no one knew that she was going to be the candidate of the Democratic Party for the presidency, but to continue her partnership in the Biden administration policy of doing everything that it could to get Hamas, of course, and Israel to yes in a negotiated process, because we're fully aware that there is no purely military solution or answer to get our loved ones home and to end the suffering in Gaza. Negotiations are a must.
So if I hear you correctly, do you trust Vice President Kamala Harris the same way that you do President Biden to do everything in their power to get the hostages released and returned to you?
Unquestionably, yes. I have confidence in Vice President Harris to put my son's life in her hands and in their hands. I've found every and any meeting that we've had, again, with really almost all of the cabinet level officials in the Biden administration, to be more than deserving of our trust as hostage member families.
Now, some hostage families were at the Republican National Convention last month. A lot of you guys are here this month. But the difference is that only 23% of Democrats support Israel's incursion in Gaza, according to a recent Gallup poll. Are you concerned that most of the Democratic Party does not understand your plight?
Well, I think most of the world doesn't really understand the situation between Israel and Hamas now, with Gaza caught in the middle and our loved ones, of course. I don't know that my opinion of or my understanding of what is happening here should depend on poll numbers. What I can say is that all of the decision makers in the Democratic Party, all of its elected officials that I've come in contact with, and I've come in contact with many dozens, if not hundreds, of Congress people and senators from the Democratic Party, have completely embraced us. Overall, it's legitimate for anyone, Democrats, Republicans, whatever, to have criticisms about Israel's conduct of the war. This is a brutal war. There's no question. That is legitimate. But at the same time, what we ask is that these same people, even if you do have criticism of Israel's conduct of the war or Israel's government, recognize the fact that Hamas sparked this horrific series of events that has led to tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths and suffering. If you are going to criticize Israel, again, legitimate. It is legitimate in general. Then you also have enough integrity to criticize Hamas for what it's done, condemn it, and then hold Hamas accountable as much as you hold the government of Israel accountable to stop this madness. And that has to begin with return of the hostages, as many as possible alive, and the bodies of those who have already been murdered and are still held by Hamas.
Now, Jonathan, as you know, there are a couple thousand protesters that have been here in Chicago, just outside the Democratic National Convention, who are protesting U.S. military aid to Israel, the war. We witnessed campus protests earlier this year with documented anti-Semitism. Given the progressive flank's stance against Israel, a number of Democrats have expressed concern about what they see as anti-Semitism on the far left. Do you fear that anti-Semitism has found a home in the Democratic Party?
I don't see my role as being a commentator on the Democratic Party. What I can say also in my other hat that was much more prominent between October 7th as a historian of the modern world, anti-Semitism has existed for a very long time under many names and in many places. In recent history, anti-Semitism on the right has always been much more lethal and much more dangerous than any other form of anti-Semitism, and that certainly exists. Anti-Semitism on the left is a newer phenomenon, and it certainly exists here in the United States. I think it's necessary for all of us to first and foremost not demonize the other. So if there are legitimate concerns on the left side of the spectrum in the Democratic Party about Israel and its conduct, I think those can be addressed as long as they are legitimate and don't spill over into anti-Semitism. I agree with the protesters that criticism of Israel, fact-based, not ideological, fact-based criticism of this or that policy is not necessarily anti-Semitism, but not allowing for the existence of a Jewish state that can defend itself and its citizens. Those are places that really do spill over towards anti-Semitism, and then it becomes illegitimate. But I don't see evidence beyond, people with megaphones, but I don't see evidence from my perch that there's any danger that anti-Semitism is overtaking the Democratic Party. I would challenge anyone to show me proof of that.
Is there anything else that you think the American public doesn't understand that you would like to tell them right now?
We live in incredibly complex times. That is for sure. There is polarization everywhere. I come from a part of the world. I grew up in Connecticut, you're right, but I've lived my entire adult life in the Middle East, which has been characterized by polarization and blind hatreds for many, many generations, centuries really. To Americans, whether you identify as a Republican or Democrat or anything else, learn something from what is happening and has happened in the Middle East, in our region, about the price of hatred. What happened on October 7th, the massacre of civilians, mass rape, mass hostage taking, that is about pure, unadulterated hate. In order to defeat that hate, both in our part of the world, in the Middle East and in the United States, we have to embrace and educate for something else by getting the hostages home, those that are still alive and those that are not. It shows that hate doesn't win. Hate is contagious. Hate is contagious. So it must be stopped in Israel, and there's also implications for the United States. If the hostages don't come home and a ceasefire is not signed quickly, there's a very real danger that in the coming weeks, there will be a regional war, a full-scale regional war in the Middle East with Israel at its center, fighting against Iran and its proxies. The United States will find it very difficult to not get involved in that conflict, and God help us all if that gets out of control. So there is a direct connection here for the American people between the fate of the hostages, those 8 Americans, but all of the 109. The only way to defuse what could be a regional war, extremely deadly, extremely dangerous for world peace, is to pressure all sides, meaning Israel and Hamas, to stop the madness now, get the hostages home, end the killing in Gaza, and perhaps we can avoid something much more terrible with much wider consequences.
Thank you so much for speaking with us, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Romina Ruiz Gueriena. I'll see you next time.